Hey guys, tonight we begin with a town so paranoid it managed to destroy itself over bad dreams and teenage drama. Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. A place where everyone believed in God, the devil, and that their neighbour was probably working for the latter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Life in Salem was about as exciting as watching bread rise, the kind of town where joy went to die and guilt was the local currency. Picture it. Grey skies, grey houses, grey souls, a community so devout it could probably make a sunrise feel inappropriate. The Puritans who settled there were religious refugees from England, fleeing persecution to establish a world where they could freely persecute each other instead. They dreamed of a city upon a hill, but what they built was more like a poorly lit basement, cold, judgmental, and haunted by the constant fear that someone, somewhere, might be enjoying themselves. These people banned dancing. They banned colourful clothes. They even banned Christmas. Their idea of celebration was sitting silently and trying not to think about hell. Sundays weren't the Lord's Day. They were endurance marathons of guilt and wooden pews. If church services lasted any longer, they'd have needed snacks and intermissions. By the winter of 1692, the villagers were restless. They'd been through failed harvests, disease, and at least 3 decades of each other's personalities. Every argument over land, livestock, or theology had turned into a slow-burning feud. And when you combine religious fanaticism with rural boredom, you don't get enlightenment, you get hysteria with a side of scripture. Even the children were losing it. With no toys, no music, and no hope, they invented games like Sit Quietly and Don't Anger God. It was inevitable that something would snap, and when it did, the town didn't blame exhaustion, famine, or maybe, just maybe, mass psychological stress. No. They blamed witches. Because of course they did. In a world where the devil was considered your nosy next-door neighbour, the explanation for every problem was obvious. Dark magic. Crops failed. Witch. Cow died. Witch. Husband looks too happy. Definitely witch. So when a few girls started shrieking and twitching in church, everyone nodded wisely and said, "Ah yes, the devil's definitely here." Because nothing says rational community like diagnosing Satan every time someone sneezes. The truth is, Salem didn't need witches to fall apart. All it needed was isolation, bad leadership, and too many people who took the Bible literally. The devil didn't destroy Salem, Puritan boredom did. It began in the winter of 1692, when 2 girls, Betty Paris, age 9, and her cousin Abigail Williams, age 11, decided that being Puritan children just wasn't miserable enough. Their daily routine consisted of chores, more chores, and mandatory guilt. So in the absence of toys or entertainment, they accidentally invented mass hysteria. Betty and Abigail began twitching, screaming, and collapsing into fits. They claimed invisible forces were biting them, pinching them, and occasionally flying through the air. The local doctor, faced with symptoms he didn't understand, took one look and said, "Definitely witchcraft," because this was the 17th century, and no clue was not an acceptable medical opinion. Soon other girls joined in. Suddenly, half the village's teenage population was speaking in tongues, barking like dogs, and throwing themselves into the snow for dramatic effect. In a town where drama was considered a sin, this was the Super Bowl. Adults gathered in awe, nodding as if they were watching the birth of science, when really it was the birth of chaos. Naturally, the Reverend Samuel Parris, father of one afflicted girl and proud owner of a very fragile ego, was thrilled. His church attendance had been dropping, but now, thanks to Satan, business was booming. The man saw demons behind every cough. If someone forgot a hymn verse, he probably exorcised them on the spot. And yet no one questioned it. No one said, maybe the girls are just stressed, cold, or trying to avoid chores. In Puritan logic, fainting in church wasn't attention-seeking. It was evidence. The The community's reasoning was beautifully simple. If something bad happens, it's the devil. If nothing bad happens, it's because we caught the devil. The villagers gathered around like it was a Netflix true crime documentary unfolding live. Who was behind the attacks? Who had cursed the children? Who had been caught baking with too much confidence lately? Eventually, 3 names surfaced. Not because of proof, but because every good witch hunt needs a few scapegoats. A slave, a beggar, and a woman who skipped church too often. Salem didn't realize it yet, but this was the opening act of a long, tragic, and incredibly stupid performance. The kind of story where the devil doesn't need to show up. People handle the destruction all by themselves. Once the girls of Salem perfected their screaming routine, the town demanded an explanation. The Reverend said it was witchcraft. The doctor agreed. The villagers nodded. Nobody thought, maybe they just need a nap. It was 1692. If something strange happened, it was always Satan's fault. Soon the question wasn't, is this witchcraft? But, who's doing it? The girls were interrogated for days, and after realizing adults actually believed their stories, they began naming names. Congratulations, humanity. You just handed a bunch of preteens the power of life and death. Their first 3 targets were perfect: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Tituba was Reverend Parris's enslaved servant, foreign, different, and therefore terrifying to the Puritan imagination. She told stories from her Caribbean homeland, which the girls adored. Naturally, this made her the prime suspect for black magic, because heaven forbid children enjoy storytelling. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who mumbled to herself, which in any other century would just make her eccentric, but in Salem made her in league with the devil. And Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who'd stopped attending church because she was ill, a sin apparently worse than murder. The trio was dragged before the magistrates and interrogated for hours. Good and Osborne denied everything, but Tituba realized quickly that truth wasn't going to save her. So she gave Salem exactly what it wanted, a supernatural soap opera. She confessed. She spoke of flying through the air on sticks, seeing red cats, black dogs, and a man with a book full of signatures. The crowd gasped. The ministers leaned forward. Tituba had invented Salem's first cinematic universe, and the moment she described other witches in the village, she guaranteed that the trials would never stop. The town exploded. People who'd spent years silently hating their neighbours suddenly found a holy excuse to ruin them. I always thought Goody Proctor looked suspicious. One might say, while Goody Proctor was home trying to remember what she did to deserve this. In less than a week, hysteria had gone viral. The list of accused grew, and Salem transformed overnight. From a sleepy Puritan backwater into the most dangerous improv theatre in America. Once Salem got a taste of witch hunting, it couldn't stop. It spread faster than a rumour in a high school cafeteria. Within weeks, half the village was either accused, accusing, or pretending to pray about it. The other half was hiding in their barns, reconsidering life choices. The afflicted girls became overnight celebrities. Their convulsions, shrieks, and dramatic fainting fits were the TikToks of 1692. People came from neighbouring towns to watch them perform in court. Every time a new witch entered the room, the girls screamed, pointed, and collapsed into what looked suspiciously like bad acting. But to the good people of Salem, it was proof that the devil was freelancing in Massachusetts. Logic didn't stand a chance. The town's leadership had gone fully feral. If you defended someone accused of witchcraft, you were accused yourself. If you stayed quiet, that was suspicious too. Basically, the only safe opinion was, yes, definitely witches, said loudly and often. Even animals weren't safe. Dogs were executed for alleged satanic activities. One was accused of bewitching a child, which raises the important historical question. What does a demonic beagle look like? The trials became a full-blown social event. Ministers prayed. Judges nodded wisely. Spectators cheered when the girls screamed on cue. It was morality theatre at its finest, starring hysteria, hypocrisy, and a total lack of self-awareness. Meanwhile, the prisons were filling up. Salem didn't even have enough jails to hold all the accused, so neighbouring towns had to help. Some families were forced to pay room and board for their own imprisonment. Imagine being billed for your own wrongful incarceration. And yet, no one stopped it. Fear had replaced reason, and mass delusion was the new religion. The villagers truly believed the devil was walking among them, wearing human faces, milking cows, and possibly running the local bakery. The real witches, of course, were nowhere to be found, but the mob didn't care. Witch hunts were less about finding evil and more about creating it, a form of community therapy with terrible side effects. By the end of spring 1692, Salem had perfected the art of collective insanity, and like any good contagion, hysteria didn't need facts, it just needed believers. By May of 1692, Salem had so many accused witches that the regular courts simply couldn't keep up. The jails were full, the ministers were exhausted, and the villagers were running out of rope. So the Massachusetts governor, William Phips, decided to form a special tribunal, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which sounds fancy until you learn it means to hear and determine. Translation: we'll listen politely and then hang you anyway. The court was headed by Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man whose entire personality could be described as self-righteous thunderstorm. Stoughton saw witchcraft everywhere. He treated every accusation as gospel, every confession as victory, and every denial as proof of guilt. A perfect resume for a man running an early modern panic festival. The court accepted spectral evidence, meaning dreams, visions, and the spirit of the accused attacking me in my sleep, all counted as legitimate proof. Imagine getting convicted because someone claimed your ghost slapped them. If that sounds ridiculous, congratulations. You'd have been burned as a skeptic. Trials began with great enthusiasm and zero logic. The afflicted girls performed their usual screaming choreography. Witnesses delivered emotional monologues about flying cats and invisible imps. Judges nodded solemnly, pretending this was all normal courtroom procedure. It was less rule of law and more group therapy for the paranoid. Meanwhile, the accused were doomed from the moment they walked in. If they denied everything, they were liars. If they confessed, they were guilty. And if they stood silently, they were obviously possessed. You couldn't win. You could only hang politely. Even respected members of society weren't safe. When Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother, was accused, some villagers protested, but the judges decided that's exactly what a clever witch would want. Sympathy. She was executed in July. Moral: never be kind in a crisis. By the time the court adjourned its first session, dozens were sentenced to death. Salem wasn't just purging witches, it was purging logic itself. The villagers finally had something to unite them: fear. And fear, as always, is the easiest thing to organise. By June, the witch trials were in full swing. Salem had officially become the 17th century equivalent of a reality show. High drama, no logic, and way too many tears. The villagers couldn't get enough of it. Every hearing drew crowds. People travelled from miles away to watch the accused squirm, confess, or faint dramatically. You could call it early American entertainment, except the losers didn't get voted off. They got hanged. The first star of the trials was Bridget Bishop, a middle-aged tavern owner with a fondness for bright clothing, a serious moral offence in Puritan fashion circles. She was known to laugh loudly, argue with men, and own an apple orchard. In Salem, that made her practically the Antichrist. When she was brought before the court, the afflicted girls immediately threw themselves into seizures, screaming that Bridget's spirit was attacking them. The judges nodded gravely. Bridget denied everything, which of course was proof that she was lying. After all, what honest witch wouldn't admit to working with Satan? Witnesses came forward with the usual nonsense: mysterious deaths of chickens, spoiled milk, suspicious laughter. One man swore he saw Bridget's ghost sitting on his chest at night. It might have been sleep paralysis, but in 1692 it was solid evidence. The jury deliberated for 5 minutes and found her guilty. She was hanged on June 10th, officially kicking off Salem's summer of stupidity. After that, the executions came in waves. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse and others followed, each accused, convicted and executed in assembly line fashion. The town became a machine that ran on fear, prayer and poorly made rope. But the more people died, the more afflicted girls popped up. Apparently, hysteria was contagious and came with a strong sense of theatre. They screamed on cue, rolled their eyes back dramatically, and sometimes even levitated, or, more likely, pretended to trip over their own skirts. Through it all, the ministers praised the court for its holy work. Villagers cheered as bodies swung, and somewhere, deep down, even the devil was probably embarrassed. The trials weren't about justice. They were about validation. Everyone wanted to prove they were on God's side, even if it meant killing half their neighbours to do it. By midsummer of 1692, the witch trials had turned confession into a survival strategy. It was simple. Admit you were a witch and live, or deny it and die. The logic was flawless, in that it made no sense at all. The court, led by the ever-zealous Chief Justice Stoughton, believed that confession was proof of repentance. After all, what better way to prove your holiness than to admit you were working for the devil? Those who denied the charges were obviously lying under Satan's influence. It was a judicial system built entirely on vibes. Confessing didn't mean freedom, though. It meant signing your name to a lie, spending weeks in prison, and snitching on others to stay alive. Salem had invented the first pyramid scheme of damnation. Confess, name your friends, and maybe God gives you a discount on execution fees. Meanwhile, the accused faced interrogation sessions that would make modern torture look like job interviews. Judges demanded names. Ministers shouted prayers. The afflicted girls screamed on cue. It was less a trial and more a psychological circus, one where the truth was the last thing anyone wanted. Some accused witches broke down quickly. Deliverance Hobbs confessed after hours of questioning and immediately started naming others. Mary Warren, who had been one of the original afflicted girls, switched sides and got accused herself. The message was clear. Nobody was safe, not even the liars, and the town loved it. People gathered outside the jails, whispering the latest gossip like it was an early episode of Dateline, Colonial Edition. Neighbours who'd spent years hating each other finally had a moral excuse to say it out loud. Salem wasn't purifying itself. It was getting even. For those who refused to confess, the outcome was already written. The gallows were waiting, and repentance was no longer the goal. Obedience was. As long as you bowed to the court's hysteria, you could live to grovel another day. By late July, the hangings were routine, the sermons predictable, and the fear industrialized. The devil didn't have to tempt Salem. He just had to sit back and watch as the faithful did his work for him. If the Salem Witch Trials were a bonfire, the ministers were the ones gleefully tossing in the wood. By summer 1692, the town's religious leaders had become the spiritual hype men of hysteria, quoting scripture, shouting about Satan, and doing everything except asking a single logical question. Leading the charge was Reverend Samuel Parris, the local preacher whose ego could have powered a small colony. Parris had started this mess when his daughter and niece went full Broadway, but instead of calming things down, he treated it like divine validation. Every new accusation made his sermons longer and his self-importance bigger. It was the best attendance his church had seen in years. Then came Reverend Cotton Mather, the intellectual celebrity of Puritan New England. Cotton had written a 300-page masterpiece about demonic possession, a thrilling read if you enjoy academic paranoia. He hadn't even visited Salem yet, but that didn't stop him from mailing in advice like an early influencer. Yes, keep fighting the devil. Don't listen to skeptics. Cotton's father, Increase Mather. Yes, that's his real name, and yes, it sounds like a rejected algebra command, was slightly more cautious. But not cautious enough. The Mathers believed witchcraft was real, dangerous, and absolutely everywhere. If you stubbed your toe, That was probably Satan testing your faith. Their sermons fanned the flames like celestial propaganda. Ministers described the devil's armies of darkness infiltrating the colonies. They painted witches as the ultimate threat. Not starvation, not disease, but women who owned goats and read too much. And the people believed it. Because when your pastor says God is watching, you listen. Especially when you're half-starved, half-frozen, and fully terrified of eternal damnation. The clergy didn't mean to start mass murder. They just wanted to feel useful. But every sermon, every pamphlet, every warning about the devil added fuel to a fire they couldn't control. Salem had turned into a sermon gone wrong, one that began with repentance and ended with rope. By the end of the summer, ministers were no longer saving souls, they were endorsing executions. It was religion weaponized, and God, apparently, had terrible PR. By August 1692, Salem had officially lost its collective mind. The trials weren't a crisis anymore. They were a lifestyle. The gallows were busier than the local market. Ministers were publishing witch-hunting guides, and every villager was one bad conversation away from being hanged. The town ran on paranoia. You couldn't even compliment someone's cow without being accused of devilish flattery. People avoided eye contact, stopped lending tools, and learned that the safest sentence in Salem was, Amen. The ones who stayed quiet were suspicious. The ones who talked too much were definitely suspicious. It was the world's first introvert apocalypse. The afflicted girls had become celebrities, the original influencers. Every twitch, scream, or fainting fit was front-page news. They claimed to see ghosts of executed witches, which the judges took seriously because, of course they did. Their testimony carried more weight than logic, evidence, or common sense combined. The girls had discovered what every future politician would later learn. If you lie with confidence, people will build a system around it. Meanwhile, the trials had completely derailed the economy. Farms were abandoned, livestock wandered off, and the harvest rotted in the fields. When half your workforce is in prison, and the other half is pretending to be possessed, productivity tends to drop. The devil didn't have to destroy Salem. The villagers were doing an excellent job all on their own. The jail cells overflowed. Dozens of people waited months for trial, some shackled to the walls. The smell alone could have exorcised a demon. Even animals were executed. One dog was reportedly hanged for looking suspicious. Imagine being a literal good boy and still catching a witchcraft charge. Still, the villagers believed they were fighting holy evil. Ministers said every hanging brought them closer to God, which was convenient, since it also made room in the prison. The trials had become a perfect machine, powered by fear, maintained by ignorance, and sanctified by prayer. By late summer, Salem wasn't a town anymore. It was a fever dream stitched together with rope and bad theology. Logic was dead, mercy was treason, and the only thing truly thriving was hysteria. While most of Salem was busy hanging its neighbours, one man decided to make his exit in style. His name was Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer who looked at hysteria, squinted and said, "No thanks." Giles was everything the Puritans secretly hated, stubborn, sarcastic, and unimpressed by authority. When he was accused of witchcraft in September 1692, he didn't panic. He didn't confess. He didn't even argue. He simply refused to plead at all. Now, refusing to plead in colonial Massachusetts wasn't a quiet protest. It was a legal nightmare. Without a plea, the court couldn't technically try you, which meant they couldn't legally seize your land after execution. Giles understood that better than anyone. He wasn't protecting his soul. He was protecting his property. He basically looked at the court and said, "You're not getting my farm, you clowns." The judges naturally took this as a personal challenge, so they resorted to a medieval punishment known as pressing, laying heavy stones on the accused until they either entered a plea or, well, flattened. It was brutal, slow, and, in the eyes of the Puritans, entirely godly. They stripped Giles naked, placed him in a field, and began stacking rocks on his chest, one by one. Witnesses said the sheriff demanded he speak, but Giles stayed silent. When he finally opened his mouth, it wasn't to beg for mercy. His last recorded words were, "More weight." That's it. The man was being crushed to death by rocks and still managed to deliver the coldest one-liner in American history. Somewhere, a metal guitarist was born spiritually. For 2 days, they kept piling on stones until his chest caved in. He never confessed, never pled, never broke. When he finally died, his land remained intact, passed down to his sons instead of the state. The government got nothing but guilt and sore backs. The irony? The same villagers who cheered his punishment later described Giles as a hero. Proof that courage could outlast madness. In a town that accused dogs, hanged old women, and called it righteousness, Giles Corey was the only man who truly refused to kneel, not before Satan, but before stupidity. By the fall of 1692, the witch craze had become so chaotic, it was practically self-sustaining. Salem didn't need evidence anymore. It just needed a pulse. Rich, poor, young, old. Everyone was either confessing, accusing, or pretending not to exist. But like all great panics, it finally hit the wrong person, someone with power. Enter Lady Mary Phipps, the governor's wife. She was elegant, respectable, and, but unfortunately, married to the man technically in charge of stopping this circus. One day, one of the afflicted girls looked up from her latest performance, widened her eyes, and screamed that she saw Mary's spectre floating in the courtroom. For context, spectre meant ghostly double. So yes, in Salem, you could be accused of crimes your astral projection allegedly committed, and the jury would nod seriously, as if this was a normal Thursday. When word reached Governor William Phipps, he had what historians politely call a reality check. Up until then, he'd been letting the court do its thing. You know, hanging civilians and billing their families for the rope. But once his wife's name entered the chat, he suddenly discovered that perhaps, maybe, the system had some flaws. It was like watching the fire chief notice the house is on fire only when his curtains catch. Phipps quickly ordered the court to stop accepting spectral evidence, which was of course the only kind of evidence Salem had. That small decision instantly dismantled the entire witch-hunting operation. Within weeks, the hysteria began to collapse. The afflicted girls still tried to perform, but the crowd had grown skeptical. Without ghost witnesses, the judges were left with awkward silences and half-baked rumours. The spell had finally broken, not through reason or repentance, but through nepotism. Because in 1692, justice didn't end when innocence was proven. It ended when the governor's wife got accused. Still, the damage was done. Dozens were dead, hundreds imprisoned, and the town's reputation had gone up in metaphorical flames. The devil, one imagines, didn't even need to interfere. He just sat back, poured himself a drink, and watched the faithful undo themselves, one accusation at a time. By late October 1692, Salem had finally run out of steam, and more importantly, out of believable witches. The hangings had slowed, the crowds had stopped cheering, and the afflicted girls were running low on new material. After months of screaming, fainting, and pointing dramatically, their spiritual stamina was fading fast. The governor's decision to ban spectral evidence, that delightful bit of nonsense where dreams counted as proof, had basically yanked the plug out of the hysteria machine. Without invisible spirits to blame, the court was left with awkward silence, nervous coughs, and the dawning realization that they might have killed a few dozen innocent people. Chief Justice William Stoughton, ever the overachiever, was not amused. He wanted to keep the hangings going. God's work, he called it. Governor William Phipps, on the other hand, had discovered a sudden passion for due process, mostly because his wife had nearly been executed for astral travel. It was the 17th century version of "this affects me personally." So, in a rare display of leadership, Phipps disbanded the Court of Oyer and Terminer entirely. New trials were suspended. Prisoners began to trickle out, pale, half-starved, and now considered awkward reminders of everyone's collective breakdown. The townsfolk didn't know whether to apologise or pretend nothing had happened. Most chose the latter. Even the clergy started backpedalling. Increase Mather, Cotton's father, and the original witch expert suddenly announced that it was better for 10 witches to escape than one innocent to die. Which, in fairness, would have been a great point to make before the executions. His son, Cotton, mumbled something about God's mysterious ways, which roughly translates to, "Please don't cancel me." By early 1693, the hysteria was officially over. No grand speech, no public repentance, just quiet embarrassment, like a small-town scandal that everyone agrees not to mention again. And so, Salem went back to being Salem, grey, cold, and deeply uncomfortable at dinner parties. The gallows were dismantled, the jails emptied, and the villagers slowly realised the devil hadn't been in their midst after all. He'd been in the mirror the entire time. When the executions finally stopped, Salem didn't erupt in relief or repentance. It just went quiet, that eerie, guilty kind of silence where everyone avoids eye contact and pretends the mass hangings were a group hallucination. The surviving villagers suddenly remembered their manners. The same people who'd cheered at the gallows now muttered, "Mistakes were made." Ministers who'd confidently shouted about Satan were now publishing essays with titles like Reflections on Our Recent Overreaction. It was the 17th century equivalent of a PR crisis, and everyone was scrambling to delete their old tweets. The colony's leaders did eventually attempt a formal apology, though it came at the glacial speed of colonial bureaucracy. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, publicly confessed in 1697 that he'd allowed himself to be deluded by the powers of darkness. He stood in church while the congregation stared, and he read a written statement of regret. It was the Puritan version of standing in the corner wearing a dunce cap. But most others stayed quiet. Chief Justice Stoughton refused to apologise at all, probably busy polishing his Best in Hysteria 1692 trophy. And Reverend Samuel Parris, whose household had started the whole mess, insisted that while he was technically sorry, he wasn't personally responsible. Translation: I'm sorry you feel that way. A few decades later, in 1711, the colony finally passed a bill restoring the names and rights of the accused. Some families even received financial compensation, about £600 total, which, divided among dozens of ruined lives, was roughly the price of one nice cow each. Generous. The villagers, eager to move on, stopped mentioning the witch thing entirely. Children grew up walking past the old hanging grounds, never knowing their grandparents had turned the place into a faith-based execution zone. History doesn't always fade. Sometimes it's just politely ignored. Over time, the fields grew quiet again. The same soil that once soaked up hysteria was ploughed for crops, and the same families that screamed for blood learned to bake pies together. But underneath every sermon, every harvest, every carefully whispered prayer, there lingered that uncomfortable truth. No one was bewitched. They were just human. And that, in the end, was the scariest part of all. Once the dust settled and the last apology was mumbled, historians, psychologists, and bored academics spent the next 3 centuries playing their favourite game. What on earth was wrong with Salem? Because let's be honest, the devil did it. Didn't hold up well under peer review. One of the earliest theories was ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on damp rye and can cause hallucinations, spasms, and paranoia. Essentially, bad bread turned into LSD. It's an appealing theory. The villagers were tripping without realising it. Unfortunately, it falls apart when you remember that ergot poisoning kills people, and nobody in Salem died from bad rye, only from bad decisions. Another theory: psychological stress. The Puritans lived in a pressure cooker. Freezing winters, constant starvation, war with neighbouring tribes, and a religion that viewed joy as a moral failure. After years of repressing every emotion, something had to snap. And when it did, it sounded like teenage girls screaming about invisible birds. Then there's the political explanation. Salem was divided between the town and the village, 2 factions constantly fighting over land, taxes, and church leadership. Witchcraft accusations conveniently targeted people on the wrong side of those disputes. Nothing unites a divided community like a shared enemy, especially one that doesn't exist. Some scholars went for the boredom theory, which, frankly, makes the most sense. Salem's kids had no toys, no social lives, and no TikTok. They lived in constant fear of damnation. Summoning the devil was probably the most exciting thing that had ever happened to them. The witch trials were less a spiritual crisis and more a 17th century group project that got wildly out of hand. And then, of course, there's the timeless theory, human stupidity. The one variable that explains every era, every empire, every witch hunt. It requires no fungus, no conspiracy, and no ghosts. Just ordinary people, terrified of things they don't understand. In the end, all the theories overlap in one uncomfortable truth. Salem wasn't cursed, bewitched, or poisoned. It was just a small town, terrified, isolated, and terminally allergic to common sense. Centuries have passed, but the ghosts of Salem never really left, mostly because people keep turning them into Halloween decorations. The once panic-stricken village is now Witch City, complete with themed cafes, tarot shops, and guided tours that promise the authentic witch trial experience. You can even buy a "Not Today Satan" mug near the site where people were hanged. Tourism truly heals all wounds. But beneath the souvenir stores and pointy hats, there's a darker truth. The Salem Witch Trials weren't a weird Puritan glitch. They were a blueprint. Fear, once institutionalized, never really goes out of style. Change the vocabulary, modernize the outfits, and you can replay Salem in any century. The trials became shorthand for collective madness, for what happens when emotion outruns evidence and paranoia gets a platform. Politicians, teachers, journalists, they've all used Salem as the ultimate cautionary tale. But let's be honest, humanity didn't exactly learn the lesson. Every few decades, someone dusts off the old script, swaps witches for communists or heretics, or whoever's trending, and the show starts again. And that's the real horror of Salem. Not the hangings, not the superstitions, but how familiar it all feels. The characters never change. You've got the terrified citizens who just want to belong, the loud preachers who claim to know the truth, the judges who think they're saving the world, and the quiet ones who know it's all wrong but stay silent anyway. The devil never needed to appear. He outsourced the job to people. Today, the same land where Salem panicked for months now hosts annual witch festivals, complete with costumes, food trucks, and crystal stalls. It's poetic, really, the ultimate apology in capitalism form. What was once a tragedy is now a marketing campaign with pumpkin spice. But if you listen closely, past the chatter, past the laughter, you can still feel it, that old hum of fear just beneath the surface. Because the truth about Salem is this: it didn't end. It just learned how to rebrand. In the Viking world, the hearth was more than just a fire pit. It was the glowing heart of the household, the centre of warmth, cooking, storytelling, and education. Forget the idea of dusty classrooms or strict tutors. Viking children learned their first lessons sitting cross-legged on fur rugs, listening to their mother's voice rise and fall like the northern wind. Every spark from the fire seemed to carry a lesson about gods, honour, and survival. The Viking mother was teacher, priestess, and lawkeeper all at once. She taught her children to speak clearly, to remember the sagas of their ancestors, and to never confuse cowardice with caution. Language was sacred, every word a weapon or a shield. Boys learned to boast properly. There was an art to that, while girls were trained to keep household records, recite family histories, and manage trade dealings when the men were away raiding. To a Viking woman, running a home was not domestic work, it was governance on a smaller scale, and her pupils were future warriors, traders, or leaders. Even before a child could walk, they absorbed the rhythm of storytelling. Mothers told tales of Odin's wisdom, Loki's mischief, and Freya's strength. These weren't bedtime distractions. They were moral textbooks. From Odin, One learned cunning and sacrifice. From Loki, the price of deceit. From Freya, the balance of beauty and ferocity. Every story carried an invisible rule: act with honor, keep your word, and never whine about the cold. But education didn't stop with words. A Viking child was expected to observe, to learn by watching how their mother settled disputes, handled trade, or stitched sails strong enough to withstand the sea. If a mother could negotiate with a merchant from the east and milk a goat before breakfast, she was a living example of competence. So while southern Europe relied on monasteries and scholars, the Norse relied on mothers with iron patience and sharper tongues. They turned every moment, from weaving wool to preparing fish, into a lesson. In this way, the hearth became the first school of the North. No tuition, no parchment, but wisdom burned into the mind as surely as fire blackened the pot. For Viking girls, education was never about embroidery and silence. It was about survival, strategy, and the subtle art of power. While boys practiced with axes, girls learned how to manage everything the men would eventually leave behind. And given how many men didn't return from raiding, this was not a theoretical skill. From an early age, Viking daughters learned to count coin, measure grain, and memorize the terms of trade agreements. A clever girl knew how to spot a dishonest merchant before he opened his mouth. She learned how to manage property, make contracts, and even file claims at the local thing, the Viking court. The law was not a mystery to her. Her mother would whisper it by the hearth, line by line, like a sacred charm. What could be owned, who could inherit, and what happened when someone broke their word. The sagas often speak of women who managed estates, freed slaves, and even commissioned ships, all without waiting for a man's permission. Girls were also trained in storytelling and memory. In a world without books, a sharp mind was more valuable than a sword. They were the family's historians, the keepers of lineage and honor. Forgetting one's ancestry was like forgetting one's soul. When an argument arose over land or bloodlines, it was often the daughter who stood up and recited 10 generations from memory, silencing the men around her. And then came the subtler lessons: diplomacy, persuasion, and reading a man's pride. Viking women didn't wield swords often, but they could disarm with words just as efficiently. A well-timed compliment could save a deal. A quiet insult could end one. The ability to balance charm and authority was as essential as knowing how to bake bread that wouldn't turn to stone. By the time a Viking girl reached marriageable age, which could be as early as 15, she was already expected to manage an entire household or even a farm. Her dowry wasn't just silver or linen. It was her education, her competence, her ability to rule in her husband's absence. And so, under her mother's watchful eye, she became what Norsemen secretly feared most: a woman who needed no one's protection but her own. If Viking girls were shaped by wisdom and trade, Viking boys were forged in the heat of discipline and danger. From the moment a boy could lift a stick, it became an axe in his imagination. The Norse didn't raise sons to be gentle. They raised them to be dependable. The kind of men who could split wood, steer a ship, and, if necessary, split a skull. Education began at home, but the lessons soon moved outdoors. Fathers, uncles, or older warriors took over from the mothers, teaching boys how to wield axes, spears, and shields. There were no wooden swords for play, only blunted real ones. Every swing carried a bruise, and every bruise was a reminder. Strength without control was dangerous. Control without courage was useless. Even games had meaning. Wrestling taught endurance. Snowball fights taught aim and teamwork. Hunting taught patience and silence. But alongside combat came the education of the tongue. Words could win wars before blades did. Boys learned how to swear oaths and deliver boasts without trembling. Breaking an oath was not just dishonor, it was a spiritual crime. Better to die than to lie, Viking mothers reminded their sons, even while patching up their torn tunics. A man's word was his weapon, and one wrong promise could haunt an entire bloodline. At feasts, young boys sat cross-legged near the elders, listening to sagas of ancient heroes and tragic fools. They memorized how loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished. It wasn't just entertainment, it was behavioral programming. Every tale ended with a moral sharper than a blade. Courage, loyalty, and generosity weren't abstract virtues. They were survival tools in a harsh world where one's reputation travelled faster than the wind. And when boys reached the edge of adolescence, their education reached its test. Some were sent on short voyages with older men to learn navigation, endurance, and the etiquette of raiding. Don't steal from your kin, don't strike from behind, and don't cry unless it's from laughter or mead. By then, the lessons of the hearth had transformed into the lessons of the axe. A Viking boy's schooling didn't produce scholars. It produced men whose hands were calloused, whose words carried weight, and whose honour, once lost, could never be bought back. Before the Vikings ever built ships, they built stories. The sagas were their libraries, their moral codes, and their Netflix, except with far more murder and fewer happy endings. Every home was filled with them, passed from one generation to the next, carried not on parchment, but in memory. To the Viking child, a saga was both bedtime story and blueprint for life. Evenings by the hearth were sacred. The flickering firelight became the teacher's podium, and the mother or scold, storyteller, became the professor. Children sat still, or else, while she wove tales of Odin's wisdom, Thor's fury, and Loki's reckless brilliance. The sagas were not meant to entertain, but to instruct. Each story carried an unspoken lesson: courage in the face of doom, loyalty to kin, and acceptance of fate, even when that fate was bleak. The Vikings didn't hide tragedy from their children. They made it educational. Listening was an art form. A child had to remember not just the story, but its rhythm, the pauses, the exact words. Oral memory was a prized skill. Forgetting a detail was like dropping a shield in battle. A good memory could earn respect. A poor one could earn mockery that lasted for winters. So mothers and fathers tested their children constantly. What did Freyr do next? Why did Sigurd die? And woe to the child who couldn't answer. The sagas also served as emotional training. Through them, children learned how to handle loss, betrayal, and triumph without falling apart. They saw heroes rise and fall, lovers curse and forgive, and tricksters escape their own stupidity. Lessons that would later help them navigate adulthood's storms. Even humour had a place. The sly wit of Loki, or the drunken boasts of Thor, reminded young minds that laughter could coexist with fear. By the time they reached adolescence, Viking children could retell dozens of sagas word for word, complete with gestures, accents, and timing. A family's reputation often depended on the eloquence of its young storytellers. To speak well was to live well. To remember was to honour. Thus, in the North, storytelling wasn't just art, it was survival. The sagas didn't just preserve the past, they prepared the future. Every Viking child carried their ancestors' voices in their head, and through them, the world stayed alive. Viking mothers had a reputation that blended tenderness with terrifying authority. They could cradle a baby one moment and silence a rowdy teenager with a single glare the next. In their world, discipline wasn't cruelty, it was structure, the spine that held the family together. A mother's love was warm, but it came wrapped in iron. Physical punishment was rare but not unheard of. The greater punishment was shame. A disappointed mother was far worse than a swing of the belt. A Viking woman could freeze her son's pride faster than a Nordic winter simply by saying, "Your father would have been ashamed." Honour was the family currency, and no child wanted to devalue it. Boys learned early that a reckless act reflected on the entire clan. Girls were taught that dignity was their armour. Lose that, and you'd be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Still, beneath the sternness, there was an unshakable current of affection. Viking mothers didn't shield their children from the world's brutality, they prepared them for it. When death came, as it often did, they taught their children not to wail, but to remember. Grief was to be carried quietly, like a blade under a cloak. Tears were allowed, but only when they fell into purpose. Mourning the dead was fine. Pitying yourself was not. Mothers also trained emotional endurance through ritual and repetition. A boy helping bury a sheep that froze in winter would be told, "This is how the gods teach us hunger." A girl who dropped her spindle might hear, "Even Freya's hands slipped once." Humour softened the lessons, but never erased them. Life was hard. Better to laugh with frost on your eyelashes than to curse the wind. Discipline extended to manners too. Children were expected to greet guests with respect, pour mead with steady hands, and never interrupt an elder, unless, of course, they were correcting a detail in a saga. Even then, they'd better be right. So, Viking motherhood was an art of balance, half affection, half fortitude. The hearth wasn't just warm because of the fire, it was warm because of the woman who commanded it. And through her blend of love and law, every child learned the first and hardest Viking lesson. Strength without kindness is savage, but kindness without strength is useless. If the Viking home was the first school, the village was the second. Out there, under the open sky, children learned that their actions rippled far beyond their family's walls. Every community was a web of alliances, debts, and grudges, and navigating that required a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of honour. For Viking children, morality wasn't memorised from scripture, it was witnessed in motion. The Thing, the great public assembly, was the Norse version of parliament, courtroom, and gossip circle rolled into one. It was where disputes were settled, laws were recited, and oaths were sworn in front of everyone who mattered. Boys were often taken along to watch, sitting quietly beside their fathers or uncles. They learned how to speak with confidence, how to accuse without dishonour, and how to defend oneself without losing dignity. Every shout, every bargain, every silence was a lesson. Girls, too, were not excluded. While they didn't stand in the circle to argue cases, they often watched from the fringes, absorbing the subtleties of tone and timing. They learned when to speak, and when silence could win more respect than any word. A clever girl could remember every outcome of every case, building a mental map of what justice meant in her world. And sometimes she'd later whisper advice to her father before the next thing, effectively shaping the family's stance. Honour and law were deeply intertwined. Children were taught that breaking an oath or lying at the Thing was not just foolish. It invited the wrath of gods and men alike. There were no written codes, no dusty scrolls. Law lived through speech and memory. The young learned that reputation was a kind of armour, light to carry but easily dented. Outside of the assembly, the entire village acted as a moral tutor, helping a neighbour during harvest, returning a lost sheep, or sharing firewood with a widow. These were not optional acts of kindness, but expected duties. A child who failed to show generosity might find themselves whispered about during winter feasts. So, while modern children learned ethics in classrooms, Viking children learned it in the marketplace of life, through eyes that never stopped watching, and a culture that never stopped remembering. To modern eyes, Viking childhood might seem brutal, but to them, it was simply preparation. Play and pain were twin teachers, and both worked overtime. Viking children weren't sheltered from hardship. They were introduced to it slowly, like cold water on the skin. The games they played looked suspiciously like military drills disguised as fun. Boys competed in wrestling matches, mock sword fights, and stone-throwing contests. They learned endurance by running barefoot across frozen ground and balance by standing on the ribs of overturned boats. Bruises were trophies, and anyone who complained risked being called nithing, cowardly. The playground was the fjord, the forest, and sometimes the deck of a ship that rocked just enough to make a child's stomach revolt. When the men returned from raids, boys watched how they carried their scars and tried to mimic the swagger. Girls, too, had their own brand of toughness. While they spun wool and fetched water, they also practiced archery, horse riding, and sometimes axe throwing, skills that could mean survival when their husbands were gone for seasons at a time. A Viking mother might hand her daughter a spindle and an axe on the same day and say, "One feeds life, the other defends it. Learn both. Even play had rules that echoed adult life. When children built tiny ships from wood scraps, they practiced leadership, assigning captains, dividing loot, settling disputes with mock oaths. Story games reenacted sagas. Someone always had to play the traitor, someone the avenger. It was emotional conditioning disguised as entertainment. By the time they reached 12, Viking children had already rehearsed most of the moral dramas they'd face as adults. Hardship was constant, but never meaningless. Falling through ice or losing a goat taught resilience faster than any lecture. Parents rarely coddled. Instead, they offered lessons in calm acceptance. The gods gave you 2 hands, they'd say, and not one of them is for whining. Compassion existed, but it was measured. Help was offered after the lesson was learned. So, through laughter, bruises, and freezing air, Viking children learned to turn pain into pride. By adulthood, they didn't just survive the North, they embodied it. Cold, beautiful, and unbreakable. In Viking society, childhood didn't fade gently into adulthood. It ended abruptly, with ceremony, risk, and a touch of blood. There was no graduation, no quiet birthday acknowledgement. One day you were a child, the next, the community expected you to stand tall, hold your tongue, and carry your own blade. For boys, the transition came through a rite that tested endurance and courage. At around 12 to 15 years old, a youth would be taken on his first voyage or hunt. There was no cheering crowd, just elders watching in silence to see if the boy could keep his fear to himself. A successful kill, a well-placed strike, or even a moment of restraint could mark the difference between respect and ridicule. When he returned, he was greeted not with hugs, but with acknowledgement. A nod from his father, a cup of mead handed by his mother, and a new seat among the men. Girls' transitions were quieter, but no less profound. When a young woman reached maturity, her education in household governance became official. She might be given her own keys, literal symbols of authority, representing the right to manage stores, servants, and wealth. A Viking woman's keys jingled like medals. They meant power, trust, and adulthood. She might also participate in rituals honouring Freya, goddess of fertility and independence, reaffirming her strength and control over her own future. Both boys and girls learned that adulthood wasn't a reward, it was a responsibility. You were now bound by your word, accountable to your clan, and expected to uphold its honour. Mistakes carried real consequences. Insult the wrong man, and you might spark a blood feud. Fail to manage your household, and your reputation could sour for generations. Even hair marked the passage. Boys might cut theirs short before setting sail, signifying readiness for battle. Girls braided theirs in new ways, practical, yet symbolic of maturity. The community noticed every change. These rites weren't just rituals, they were contracts with life itself. The child who once sat by the hearth now faced storms, trade, and warfare. The girl who once spun wool now ruled over men and money. In the Viking world, growing up wasn't about age. It was about endurance, mastery, and the moment everyone else stopped calling you child. In the Viking world, education never truly ended. It simply changed hands. The same children who once sat by the fire, wide-eyed at their mother's sagas, eventually became the storytellers, teachers, and lawkeepers themselves. The Norse understood that knowledge was as fragile as life at sea. If not passed on, it vanished. So every generation became both student and teacher in an endless cycle of remembrance. By adulthood, Vikings had no written diplomas, no libraries, and no scholars in robes. Yet they carried more history in their minds than most monasteries stored on parchment. Memory was their archive, and storytelling was their method of preservation. The sagas were recited again and again, at weddings, feasts, funerals, and long winter nights, each retelling sharpening the details, ensuring that no ancestor was forgotten. A child who could quote their lineage was a living monument. One who couldn't was a nobody. This system made every household a miniature academy of survival. Fathers taught navigation by stars, mothers taught herbs and lore, elders taught patience and humility. The sea, the soil, and the seasons were textbooks written by the gods. Education wasn't about collecting facts. It was about understanding fate, strength, and consequence. The Viking who ignored his mother's wisdom often learned it later. Painfully. Even death carried lessons. When elders felt their time nearing its end, they prepared their families not with tears, but with instruction. They told stories of raids gone wrong, of comrades who broke oaths, of kings who trusted the wrong hand. These weren't eulogies. They were warnings. To die without passing on wisdom was considered almost shameful, a betrayal of both kin and gods. And so, Viking education became the quiet engine of their civilization. It turned an illiterate people into poets and explorers, bound by memory stronger than ink. When their ships crossed to distant lands, from Iceland to Byzantium, they carried not scrolls, but songs, tales, and laws alive in their minds. In the end, Viking motherhood and education were inseparable forces. The woman by the fire was not just raising children. She was maintaining the continuity of an entire culture. Through her words, the North remembered itself, fierce, proud, and never silent. By the spring of 1615, Japan's swords had been sheathed for almost 2 decades, but the silence was deceiving. The land had not forgotten the taste of war. It had merely been forced to swallow it. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the old fox of politics, sat in his palace at Edo, watching, waiting, and listening. And what he heard disturbed him, whispers rising from the great stone walls of Osaka Castle. There, the Toyotomi clan still lived, or rather, still refused to die. Toyotomi Hideyori, the son of the once mighty unifier Hideyoshi, was now a young man. Officially, he was no threat to the Tokugawa. But unofficially, he was the ember that could ignite another civil war. His castle, Osaka-jo, was the largest, wealthiest, and most impregnable fortress in Japan. And inside its walls gathered all those who missed the old days of blood and glory. Wandering ronin, discontented lords, and nostalgic warriors who believed the Tokugawa had smothered the samurai spirit under layers of bureaucracy and peace. Osaka became a beacon, or a warning. To many, Hideyori represented the true heir of Japan's unification, the son of a man who had risen from peasantry to rule the nation through brilliance and force. To Ieyasu, however, Hideyori was a ticking time bomb wrapped in silk. The Tokugawa shogunate had only recently taken root, and Ieyasu, though officially retired, still pulled the strings behind the throne. He understood that if the Toyotomi name wasn't erased, his dynasty would forever stand on sand. So, while Japan's farmers prepared for spring planting, Ieyasu prepared for war. Messengers rode under moonlight, spies passed through sake houses, maps were drawn, and generals recalled. The shogunate's patience had run out. Meanwhile, within Osaka Castle, the atmosphere was shifting. The corridors echoed with the laughter of samurai sharpening their blades. Mothers whispered prayers. Old soldiers drank sake by candlelight, boasting that if the Tokugawa came, they'd make the earth itself bleed. But beneath the bravado, everyone knew. The peace that had lasted since the Battle of Sekigahara was dying. The drums of destiny were beating again. And as dawn rose over the mist-shrouded moat of Osaka Castle, Japan, weary of peace, prepared once more to burn. Inside Osaka Castle, power didn't rest in Toyotomi Hideyori's young hands, but in those of his mother, Yodogimi, a woman as beautiful as she was formidable. She had watched her husband, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rise from peasant roots to become Japan's ruler, and she wasn't about to let his legacy fade under the shadow of Tokugawa rule. To her, the Tokugawa weren't bringers of peace. They were usurpers who had stolen her husband's dream and her son's inheritance. Yodogimi understood politics the way a swordsman understood the weight of his blade. She knew that peace built on fear could not last. So she began to gather the discontented, masterless samurai, wandering swordsmen, and proud lords who had lost favor under Tokugawa rule. These men, the Ronin, were ghosts of the old world. Men with no masters, no income, and too much pride. And when word spread that Osaka Castle would welcome them and pay them, they came from every corner of Japan like moths to a dying flame. By the winter of 1614, the fortress had become a living legend. Its walls were said to be unbreachable, its moats wide enough to swallow armies. Within, thousands of warriors sharpened their swords, repaired their armor, and spoke of honor as though it were a forgotten religion. Poets and priests mingled with mercenaries. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging blades for a war no one officially admitted was coming. Yodogimi orchestrated it all with cunning precision. She promised her followers redemption, a chance to die for something greater than survival. And to those who still hesitated, she reminded them of their ancestors, who had lived by the sword and died in glory. Better to fall in fire, she was rumoured to say, than to rot in peace. Meanwhile, spies loyal to Tokugawa Ieyasu infiltrated Osaka's streets, reporting that the castle's garrison was swelling by the day. The shogunate pretended not to notice, but Ieyasu's patience was thinning. He had spent his youth mastering war, and his old age pretending peace. Now the Toyotomi dared to defy him again. And so, beneath Osaka's golden rooftops, a storm was gathering. Yodogimi's rebellion wasn't just about revenge. It was about memory. The spirit of Hideyoshi still haunted Japan, and his widow was determined to make sure it didn't rest quietly. In November 1614, the Tokugawa army began its march toward Osaka, an unstoppable tide of banners, armor, and ambition. Over 200,000 men advanced under the shogunate's command, their armor gleaming like black scales beneath a grey sky. The air was thick with frost and the smell of gunpowder. For the first time in Japan's long civil wars, foreign cannon, cast in the European style, were rolled into position. It was not just a battle between clans anymore. It was the old world colliding with the new. Inside the towering walls of Osaka Castle, Hideyori and Yodogimi prepared for the inevitable. Their garrison, numbering perhaps 100,000 samurai and ronin, watched the enemy gather across the frozen plains. Morale was high, partly from pride, partly from denial. Many still believed the castle was invincible. Its moats were deep, its walls thick, its defenders fierce. "Let the Tokugawa come," some boasted. "They'll break their teeth on these stones." But the siege that followed was unlike anything Japan had seen before. The Tokugawa army dug trenches, built fortifications, and unleashed a relentless barrage of cannon fire. Day and night, the thunder echoed across the snow-covered plains. Stones and fireballs smashed against the castle's walls. Inside, children hid under straw mats, while monks prayed and samurai shouted chants to steel their nerves. Yet, Osaka held firm. In the chaos of December, the Toyotomi launched daring counterattacks, swift night raids that slashed through the Tokugawa camps and vanished into the darkness. Women served as messengers, and even entertainers picked up weapons. The defenders fought not for victory, but for legacy, to prove that the Toyotomi bloodline would not surrender quietly to time or tyranny. By the end of the winter, both sides were exhausted. The siege had turned the once lush plains into a frozen wasteland of corpses and broken armor. But the Tokugawa still couldn't breach the castle, so Ieyasu turned to deception instead of strength. Negotiations were offered. A truce was signed. The Toyotomi agreed to dismantle their outer defences in exchange for peace. And as snow melted into mud, the guns fell silent. But deep down, every man on both sides knew this peace would not last. Ieyasu wasn't finished. He was only waiting for spring. When winter finally broke, so did the siege, or so it seemed. The Tokugawa and the Toyotomi signed what was called a peace treaty, though it was crafted more like a blade than a document. The agreement stated that Osaka Castle would dismantle its outer defences in exchange for safety and recognition. On paper, it was mercy. In reality, it was the opening act of betrayal. Tokugawa Ieyasu had no intention of letting the Toyotomi survive another season. He had watched their walls withstand cannon fire, and their spirit refuse surrender. If brute force couldn't destroy Osaka, then cunning would. So while the Toyotomi celebrated, Ieyasu smiled, the kind of smile that comes right before a knife slips between ribs. Hideyori's men, trusting in the treaty, began removing their fortifications. Moats were filled, walls levelled, and gates weakened. The defenders thought peace had been earned. The shogunate merely watched them dismantle their own shield. Within months, Osaka Castle, once the mightiest fortress in Japan, stood exposed, its once impenetrable layers stripped bare by diplomacy. Inside the castle, spirits were uneasy. Some ronins smelled the trick and begged Yodogimi to fortify again, but others, weary from the long winter, clung to hope. Even Hideyori hesitated, torn between his mother's fierce instinct and his desire to believe the war was over. He was still young, idealistic, and perhaps too honourable for the age he lived in. Meanwhile, the Tokugawa prepared once more. Weapons were repaired, troops were recalled, and orders spread quietly through the provinces. Ieyasu himself, nearly 75, refused to stay behind. "A man must finish what he starts," he said, summoning his war council. The peace of early 1615 became a mirage, beautiful, brief, and deadly. Markets reopened, cherry blossoms bloomed, and Osaka's survivors dared to breathe again. But beneath the petals, war drums rumbled. That spring, the Tokugawa army began to move once more. This time, there would be no truce, no negotiation, no pretense. The old shogun was done playing chess. He was ready to burn the board. And so, as the snow melted into rivers of mud and cherry blossoms drifted over the plains, Japan's final great war prepared to erupt anew, in fire, steel, and betrayal. By early May of 1615, the illusion of peace had completely shattered. The Toyotomi banners once again flew defiantly above Osaka Castle, crimson circles against the pale sky, as messengers galloped across Japan calling the ronin back to arms. The castle's courtyards echoed with the sound of hammers reforging armour, of monks chanting war prayers, of mothers sharpening spears, meant for sons too young to hold them. The second siege, the summer campaign, had begun. Tokugawa Ieyasu, old yet relentless, rode at the head of an army that dwarfed the first. Nearly 200,000 men advanced like a tidal wave, encircling Osaka from every side. The fields that had been frozen months before now shimmered with heat and dust. Soldiers marched beneath banners embroidered with the triple hollyhock crest of Tokugawa, symbols that meant law, order, and submission. Behind them, cannon crews rolled their foreign guns once more into place, polishing the iron mouths that would soon roar death into the sky. Inside the castle, Hideyori and Yodogimi prepared to die rather than surrender. Every hall was fortified, every tower armed. Ronin poured through the gates, pledging their lives to the last battle of the samurai age. Some came for loyalty, others for pride, and some simply because they had nowhere else to die. It was said that there were so many banners in Osaka's courtyards that the wind itself could not pass without brushing silk. The fighting began almost immediately. The Tokugawa forces struck fast, cutting off supplies and torching nearby villages to starve the defenders. But the Toyotomi countered with ferocity. Night raids set enemy camps ablaze. Ambushes turned narrow roads into slaughter pits. Every skirmish carried the rage of men who knew there would be no tomorrow. Amid the chaos, Ieyasu watched calmly from his command post, his armour gleaming black beneath the summer sun. He wasn't in a hurry. Age had made him slow, but it had also made him cruelly patient. He didn't need to take the castle in a day. He only needed to exhaust it. The summer heat thickened, corpses piled high, and Osaka burned at its edges. Both sides knew what this campaign meant. This wasn't just a siege. It was Japan's final reckoning, the death rattle of an age built on honor, ambition, and steel. By June of 1615, Osaka's fate hung by a thread. The castle's defenders were starving, exhausted, and outnumbered, yet their resolve hadn't dimmed. The Tokugawa army had encircled the fortress, but the Toyotomi still had one final gamble left. Hideyori's generals decided that if Osaka was to fall, it would not do so quietly. On June 4th, they led their warriors out of the gates and into open battle, the last great clash of Japan's warring age. The plain of Tennoji stretched wide and shimmering under the summer sun. Across it stood the Tokugawa forces, arrayed in perfect formation, banners snapping, muskets glinting, drums rolling like thunder. In contrast, the Toyotomi army was smaller, but ferociously determined. They had nothing left to defend except their honour. Commanding them was the legendary general Goto Matabe, who tied his hair in a war knot, whispered a prayer to the gods, and charged first. The initial assault was devastating. The Toyotomi samurai, hardened by desperation, tore through the Tokugawa vanguard like a blade through cloth. Muskets roared, arrows darkened the air, and for a brief, miraculous hour, it seemed as though the impossible might happen. The shogunate line began to bend. Even Ieyasu himself, overseeing the battle from a hilltop, was said to have been shaken by the ferocity of the attack. But numbers and discipline soon decided what courage alone could not. Reinforcements swept in from both flanks, surrounding the Toyotomi warriors in a tightening ring of steel. Cannons thundered, smoke swallowed the field, and the advance stalled. Matabe fell, his armour shattered, his banner trampled. Still, his men fought on, slashing through ranks until they were cut down to the last. By midday, the Toyotomi forces were in retreat. Blood soaked the fields of Tennoji. The cries of the wounded mingled with the beating of retreat drums. From the walls of Osaka, Yodogimi watched the battlefield burn, knowing what it meant. The last of their army was gone. That night, the plains still smoked, littered with thousands of bodies. The old gods of war had taken their tribute, and the sun set crimson over a Japan that would never see such chaos again. The Battle of Tennoji had ended, and so too had the age of the samurai's open defiance. After the slaughter at Tennoji, the survivors staggered back toward Osaka Castle, wounded, bloodied, and broken. The plains around the fortress were a sea of smoke and corpses, and behind that curtain of ruin marched the Tokugawa army. This time there would be no truce, no terms, no mercy. As dawn broke, the final assault began. Cannon fire shook the earth, blasting holes through the castle walls. Arrows and bullets rained down in endless waves, cutting through men, women, and even children who carried water to the defenders. The roar of war echoed through every corridor, every courtyard. Osaka Castle, once the jewel of the Toyotomi clan, now stood as a giant tomb. Inside, chaos reigned. The defenders fought room by room, staircase by staircase. Ronin charged through collapsing gates with nothing left but broken blades. Women carried spears, archers fired from windows until smoke choked their lungs, and monks beat war drums until their hands bled. Every hall was filled with firelight and screams. It was no longer about victory. It was about defiance, about dying on one's feet rather than kneeling to the shogunate. Yodogimi, calm even as the walls shook around her, ordered her attendants to prepare the inner sanctum. She knew this was the end, but she would not let her son be captured alive. Toyotomi Hideyori, now 22, donned his armour for the first and last time. "Let us die with honour," he said to his followers. His mother simply nodded, holding a dagger meant for both of them. The flames spread faster than any army. Roof tiles cracked from the heat, towers collapsed into ash. From the distance, Tokugawa Ieyasu watched in silence as smoke swallowed the sky. Some said he wept, others said he smiled. By nightfall, Osaka Castle was gone, consumed entirely by fire. Those who escaped told of mothers leaping into the flames with their children, of samurai who bowed to the east before plunging their swords into their bellies. It was not a battle anymore. It was ritual suicide on the scale of a nation. The fire burned for 3 days, and when it finally died, so too did the last heartbeat of the Toyotomi. When the flames finally began to fade, Osaka Castle was no longer a fortress. It was a grave. The air reeked of ash and iron, the moats ran red, and the once golden rooftops were now blackened skeletons against the sky. Among the ruins, the last of the Toyotomi line awaited their fate. Inside the innermost chamber, Yodogimi and her son, Toyotomi Hideyori, sat in silence. The roar of the fire outside sounded like waves crashing against eternity. There were no more soldiers left to command, no allies to call upon. Only the dignity of choosing how to die. The Tokugawa had offered no path to surrender. For them, the existence of Hideyori was itself a rebellion. As the flames crept closer, Yodogimi prepared for the inevitable. She had lived through the rise of her husband, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who had unified Japan through sheer will. Now she would watch that dream die in smoke. In her final act, she ensured her son's death would not be a spectacle for Ieyasu's court. Hideyori bowed before the household shrine, whispering prayers to his ancestors, then performed seppuku, the ritual suicide of a samurai. His retainers followed, one after another, until the room fell silent, except for the crackling of fire. Yodogimi joined him soon after, choosing death beside her son rather than capture. When Tokugawa soldiers entered the ruins the next morning, they found only ashes and broken blades. The Toyotomi crest, once a symbol of ambition and unity, lay scorched beneath the rubble. Ieyasu ordered that the remains be buried and the castle completely levelled. He understood the power of symbols, and he meant to erase this one forever. For the survivors, Osaka's fall marked more than the end of a family. It was the end of an era. The age of constant warfare that had shaped Japan for centuries was over. The sword would now serve the pen, and the warrior's duty would shift from conquest to obedience. Yet legends of Osaka's fall spread quickly. Poets spoke of it as a noble tragedy, a last stand against inevitability. And somewhere in that smoke, the ghost of Hideyoshi, the peasant who became ruler, seemed to whisper, "Even fire cannot burn memory." When the smoke of Osaka finally drifted away, Japan awoke to a strange quiet. The land that had been drenched in blood for over a century now lay still. Not with peace born of harmony, but with peace imposed by fear. The Toyotomi were gone, their ashes scattered beneath the ruins of their own pride. And in their absence, the Tokugawa shogunate rose like an iron sunrise over the nation. Tokugawa Ieyasu, now in his 70s, had done what no warlord before him had managed. He ended the age of war by extinguishing every spark capable of reigniting it. With the destruction of Osaka Castle, the final obstacle to his dynasty's rule had been erased. The swords of Japan were sheathed, and the age of the samurai, at least as warriors, had come to an end. From this point on, their duty would be to serve, not to fight. In Edo, Ieyasu's capital, edicts were issued with ruthless efficiency. Travel was restricted, castles were dismantled, and the great families were ordered to send their heirs as hostages to the shogun's court, a leash disguised as loyalty. Trade and agriculture flourished, but the fire of ambition that had once driven Japan's warlords was smothered beneath the weight of order. The shogunate called it peace. Some whispered it was a beautiful prison. For the few who survived Osaka's fall, the new world felt hollow. The wandering ronin who once dreamed of glory now drifted through the countryside, blades rusting at their sides, telling tales of the castle that had burned rather than bow. The poets and monks of the following decades would turn those stories into legend, the final act of an age when men fought for honour, not bureaucracy. As for Ieyasu, he lived only a short while after his victory. In 1616, the old shogun died in his sleep, leaving behind a nation terrified of rebellion, and yet grateful for stability. His tomb at Nikko would become a shrine, and his dynasty would rule for over 250 years. The fire that consumed Osaka did not just end a clan, it ended a spirit. But it also forged something new, a Japan that traded its sword for structure, its passion for permanence, and its chaos for control. The warring states had ended, and the long peace, the Pax Tokugawa, had begun. In October of 331 BCE, the dust of the battlefield at Gaugamela had barely settled when Alexander the Great turned his gaze toward Babylon, the jeweled heart of Mesopotamia, the city of gods and empires. Word of Darius III's defeat had already reached its walls, but instead of defiance, the Babylonians offered something no Greek army had ever expected: open gates. Alexander entered not as a destroyer, but as a spectacle. The streets were lined with priests, dancers, and nobles dressed in crimson and gold. Incense filled the air, mingling with the sound of flutes and chants. "Liberator of Asia," they called him, bowing as he rode through the Ishtar Gate on a white horse. For once, there was no blood, no siege, only surrender gilded in ceremony. Babylon had decided that survival was wiser than resistance. The city stunned him. Its walls were taller than any he had ever seen, its streets wide and shimmering with baked brick. The great ziggurat of Marduk, temple of the chief god of Babylon, towered above the skyline like a staircase to heaven. Alexander, who had spent his life conquering stone and soil, suddenly stood in a city that felt eternal. Even his hard-nosed Macedonian veterans fell silent at the sight of it. The people adored him. He released prisoners, honoured local gods, and promised restoration to temples long neglected under Persian rule. He even ordered sacrifices to Marduk, declaring that the Babylonian gods had aided his victory. The priests nodded approvingly. A conqueror who understood divine politics was one worth keeping alive. But beneath the cheers and garlands, something shifted in Alexander's heart. The boy from Macedon, who once slept beneath the stars beside his soldiers, now slept in the golden chambers of Nebuchadnezzar's palace. He sat on Darius's throne and began to see himself not as a foreign invader, but as a ruler destined to unite worlds. Greece and Persia, West and East. Why not both? That night, as torchlight flickered on the Euphrates and Babylon's musicians played their slow, hypnotic songs, Alexander looked out over the city and whispered to himself, This is the beginning of something greater." He was right, but not in the way he hoped. Once the gates of Babylon closed behind him, Alexander began to change. The Macedonian conqueror, who had once dined beside his soldiers and marched through dust and blood as one of them, now found himself surrounded by silks, courtiers, and whispers. He took up residence in Darius's great palace, a marvel of polished stone and scented gardens, and for the first time in his life he sat upon another man's throne. At first it was symbolic, a gesture of victory, but symbols have a way of reshaping the man who wields them. Alexander began wearing the Persian diadem, adopting the long robes of the great kings, and sitting upon a raised dais during audiences. Visitors were expected to bow, even to prostrate themselves before him, a Persian custom called proskynesis. To his Macedonian companions, this was an abomination. They had followed him as king, not as god. Whispers spread through the palace like smoke. Men who had once called him brother now spoke of him in the third person. "Alexander has forgotten himself," one soldier muttered. "He's becoming Persian." But Alexander saw it differently. To rule the East, he believed he must become part of it. To conquer a people was not enough. One had to inherit their spirit, their customs, their gods. He married Persian women of noble blood and encouraged his officers to do the same. He reinstated Persian administrators and placed local satraps back into power, pairing them with Greek overseers. Babylon became a living experiment, a fusion of two worlds, East and West, reason and mysticism, Olympus and Ahura Mazda. but such unity came at a price. At feasts, Alexander's Macedonian generals grew restless as courtiers bowed and Persians toasted his divinity. Old comrades like Parmenion and Clytus whispered that their king had been bewitched by luxury. Alexander ignored them. "They think small," he told Hephaestion one night. "They see a throne. I see a world." Yet beneath that grand vision lurked a dangerous truth. The more he embraced the East, the more he alienated the men who had carried him there. The boy who had once sought to emulate Achilles now sought to surpass him, not as a hero, but as something divine. And Babylon, with its intoxicating beauty, was the perfect place to forget that even gods can bleed. In the months that followed, Babylon transformed from a conquered city into the beating heart of Alexander's empire, a place where Greek marble met Persian gold. He summoned architects, philosophers, and astrologers from every corner of his dominion. Greek artisans carved statues of Athena beside temples to Marduk. Persian scribes recorded Greek laws in cuneiform. It was a strange harmony, brilliant, fragile, and utterly new. Alexander called it the union of peoples. His dream was not to rule over nations, but to merge them, Macedonians, Persians, Egyptians, Bactrians, into one race under one divine king. He held grand banquets where Greek generals sat beside Persian satraps, sharing wine and stories they barely understood. To the idealists, it was a vision of peace. To the veterans who had fought their way from the Hellespont to the Tigris, it was blasphemy. The soldiers grumbled that their king had gone native. They mocked his Persian robes, his use of incense, his golden throne. At night, they whispered of omens, that Alexander had angered Zeus by calling himself the son of Ammon, that the gods of Greece no longer walked beside him. The more he tried to unite them, the further apart his armies drifted. Yet Alexander pressed on, convinced that destiny favoured him. "The world is not divided," he said during one of his lavish banquets. "It is we who draw the lines." He began to see himself as the living bridge between two civilizations, a man chosen by the gods to fuse East and West. Babylon, with its palaces and gardens, became his laboratory for this grand experiment. But unity built on ambition is a fragile thing. His officers began quarrelling over privilege. Macedonians resented Persians being given equal rank. Persians resented Macedonian arrogance. The more Alexander preached equality, the more his empire rippled with quiet rebellion. And somewhere beneath the celebration, beneath the wine, the music, and the gleaming marble, something darker took root. Paranoia. He began to suspect plots where none existed, to test loyalty with cruelty. His friends noticed the change, but dared not speak of it. The conqueror who had defeated Darius now faced a new enemy, himself. In the twilight of Babylon, Alexander was no longer just building an empire. He was beginning to lose his soul to it. Power, like wine, can sour when left too long in the cup. By 328 BCE, Alexander's victories had made him untouchable, and isolation began to twist that power inward. He no longer saw himself as the boy from Macedon, but as a vessel of divine will. Those who had once been comrades were now subjects, and their loyalty was something to be tested, not trusted. At first it began with suspicion, whispers of conspiracies, secret punishments, and quiet executions. He began to drink more heavily, as though the wine could silence the restless gods in his mind. His soldiers still cheered him, but their laughter died when he passed. The boy they had followed through deserts and storms now looked at them with the eyes of a man surrounded by ghosts. The breaking point came at a banquet in Maracanda, a night meant for celebration that ended in blood. Clytus the Black, one of his oldest friends, the man who had saved his life at the Battle of Granicus, drank too much and spoke too freely. He mocked Alexander's Persian clothes, called him arrogant, reminded him that his victories were won by Macedonian steel, not divine favour. "You forget who made you king," Clytus shouted, slamming his cup to the floor. The room froze. "Alexander," flushed with rage and drink, hurled back accusations of ingratitude and treachery. Friends tried to restrain him, but pride had already lit the fuse. In a blur of fury, he seized a spear and drove it through Clytus's chest. The laughter, the music, the celebration, all vanished in an instant. Clytus fell, and with him, something inside Alexander died too. The next morning, the conqueror of Asia wept over the body. He refused food for days, calling himself a murderer unworthy of his own empire. His generals begged him to rise, reminding him that kings could not afford remorse. Eventually, he did, but the remorse didn't fade. It hardened into something else. Cold conviction. If the world demanded a god, then a god he would become. Untouchable, unquestioned, and above the frailty of men. From that night on, Babylon would never see laughter at his feasts again. Only silence, and the uneasy sound of power devouring its own. After Clytus's death, something irreversible shifted inside Alexander. The grief that had once softened him was now replaced by an almost religious conviction that he was not merely mortal. The blood on his hands was no longer guilt, he told himself, but divine sacrifice. To his followers, he began to speak not as a man, but as one chosen by the heavens. In Babylon, he demanded proskynesis from everyone. Macedonians, Persians, even his oldest companions. They were to bow before him as before a god. The ritual, common in Persian court, was alien to his men. Macedonian pride recoiled at the sight. "We bow to no man," they muttered, but none dared challenge him directly, not after Clytus. Those who refused were quietly reassigned, dismissed, or vanished altogether. He wore white robes now, edged with gold, the attire of divine kings. He invoked Zeus Ammon, the god whose oracle had once proclaimed him a son of divinity. "All lands under one sky," he would say, "and I at the centre, the living bridge between gods and men." To some, it sounded visionary. To others, heretical. His court in Babylon turned into a theatre of worship. Musicians played hymns to his greatness. Poets compared him to Achilles and Dionysus, and priests from across Asia offered him crowns of divinity. The air smelled of incense and fear. Even Hephaestion, his closest companion, began to watch him with cautious eyes. But beneath this divine theatre lay restlessness. Alexander was too young, too hungry to simply rule. Conquest had been his oxygen, and peace now suffocated him. Maps of Arabia, India, and even the distant western seas covered his chambers. "There are always more worlds," he said one night, "if one dares to find them." His generals shifted uneasily. They had already followed him farther than any Greek had ever dreamed. Yet to Alexander, standing still meant dying. The gods, he believed, had chosen him not to rest, but to continue. And so, surrounded by worshippers, he began to plan again. More campaigns, more temples, more glory. But for all his talk of divinity, Babylon's air carried a different whisper. Men who claimed to be gods did not live long. And the gods, jealous of mortals who reached too high, had already begun to watch him closely. In 324 BCE, Babylon witnessed an event that even Alexander's armies could not conquer, the death of Hephaestion. For years he had been more than a friend, more than a general. He was Alexander's mirror, his balance between reason and impulse, his human anchor in a world that now worshipped him as divine. When Hephaestion fell ill with fever in Ecbatana, the physicians thought little of it. But within days, he was dead. And when Alexander received the news, something inside him broke. Witnesses said he threw himself on the body, refusing to let go. He fasted for days, cutting his hair as Achilles had done for Patroclus, his legendary forebear. He ordered the doctor executed, not for negligence, but because grief needed a scapegoat. All Babylon was ordered into mourning. Music, laughter, even festivals were forbidden. Horses were shorn, temples draped in black. For months, the greatest city in the world became a funeral pyre for one man. Then came the construction, the most extravagant funerary monument the East had ever seen. Columns of gold and cedar rose high over the Euphrates. Statues of lions and gods lined the path. Alexander spared no expense, spending treasures that could have funded an army. He declared Hephaestion a divine hero, commanding that sacrifices be made to him across the empire. Some whispered that he sought to resurrect him through ritual, as if the grief of a god could undo death itself. His generals watched in silence, terrified and awed. This was not the same Alexander who had crossed deserts and rivers laughing beside them. This was a man haunted, his eyes hollow, his temper mercurial. One day he wept, the next he raged at priests, accusing them of betrayal for failing to bring omens of Hephaestion's spirit. When the fires of the funeral burned, their smoke rose into Babylon's skies like a black crown. Standing before it, Alexander whispered, "No mortal has taken more of me than he." The words drifted upward with the ashes, perhaps meant for gods he no longer trusted. From that day on, Alexander was not merely a conqueror mourning a friend. He was a living ghost, a man convinced that the only way to see Hephaestion again was to follow him. And that, soon enough, he would. By the spring of 323 BCE, Babylon had become both Alexander's capital and his cage. The city pulsed with his ambitions, fleets being built for Arabian expeditions, new temples rising beside old Mesopotamian shrines. But around him, strange signs began to appear. The priests warned of bad omens. A lion escaped from its pen and wandered through the royal garden. Ravens fought and died above the palace. A man was caught sitting on Alexander's throne while the king was away. To the Babylonians, such things were messages from the gods. To Alexander, they were challenges. He laughed off the warnings, declaring that no omen could frighten the son of Zeus Ammon. Yet in private, he consulted seers more often than ever. His dreams grew dark, rivers of blood, towers collapsing, Hephaestion's voice calling from the beyond. The once invincible conqueror had begun to fear the one frontier no sword could cross. Still, he refused to rest. "I will march again," he told his generals. Arabia was next, and after that, perhaps the edges of the world itself. But his men were weary. They had fought from Greece to India and back, and Babylon, with its gardens and women and gold, tempted them to stay. Whispers spread through the camps. The king had lost his reason, that the gods he claimed as kin were turning against him. Then came the banquet. It was a humid evening in June when Alexander joined his companions for a night of wine and triumph. He drank deeply, more than usual, laughing, singing, even planning future conquests. Suddenly, as the story goes, he felt a sharp pain in his side. "I feel a stabbing within me," he said, clutching his ribs. His friends thought it the drink. It was not. Over the next few days, his fever climbed. The mighty voice that once commanded empires grew hoarse. His limbs trembled. Yet he continued to issue orders, lying on his bed in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, dictating plans for armies that would never march. When his soldiers filed past to see him one last time, he could no longer speak, only raise his hand in silent farewell. Outside, the omens stopped. Babylon had gone quiet, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The gods had made their decision. By early June 323 BCE, the palace at Babylon had fallen into a dreadful silence. The once mighty conqueror now lay motionless upon a golden bed, drenched in sweat, his breath shallow and laboured. Physicians swarmed the chamber, whispering guesses, poison, fever, exhaustion. But none dared speak the truth. The man who had outlived every blade and storm was dying, and no one knew why. For 11 days, Alexander lingered between life and legend. Some said his fever came from the Euphrates marshes. Others believed it was divine punishment for claiming godhood. He drifted in and out of delirium, speaking of Hephaestion, of new conquests, of ships that would never sail. When attendants tried to comfort him, he brushed them away, murmuring, "Toil and sleep, the twin brothers of kings." His generals waited outside the chamber, each pretending to pray while calculating their next move. The empire stretched from Greece to India, vast, rich, and utterly ungovernable. Without Alexander, it was an empire without a son. One night, as his voice grew faint, they gathered around his bed and asked the question that would haunt history. "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" Alexander's eyes flickered open. Some claimed he whispered, "To the strongest." Others said he simply nodded, unable to speak. It didn't matter. His silence was enough to unleash decades of war. On June 10th, his breathing stopped. The soldiers who had followed him across deserts and mountains filed through the chamber in stunned silence, each pressing his lips to the king's cold hand. Babylon, the city that had welcomed him as a god, now watched as priests prepared his body with oils and gold. Outside, the Euphrates flowed quietly, carrying away the last echoes of his command. Rumours spread faster than the river's current. Some swore he had been poisoned by his generals. Others said he had simply ascended, claimed by Zeus Ammon to sit among the immortals. Whatever the truth, the man who had conquered the world left it at just 32, undefeated in battle, but conquered by fate itself. And as his empire began to fracture, one thing became clear. Alexander had not united the world. He had only held it together for as long as his heart continued to beat. When Alexander's body finally went cold, Babylon did not mourn quietly. The city became a cauldron of fear, grief, and ambition. Outside the palace walls, thousands of soldiers wept openly, not just for their king, but for the end of their purpose. For 12 years, they had followed him across the known world, through deserts, storms, and endless wars. Now, with the man who had led them into immortality lying lifeless on his bed, they were left staring into the void. Inside the palace, chaos bloomed. His generals, the Diadochi, or successors, gathered to decide who would rule the largest empire in history. Some demanded that Alexander's unborn child, if male, be proclaimed king. Others scoffed, insisting the empire should be divided among them. Old rivalries, long buried under the weight of Alexander's will, now burst into the open. The conqueror's dream of unity began to crack before his body was even buried. They fought over his corpse as if it were a throne. Ptolemy of Egypt claimed it for himself, arguing that wherever Alexander's body rested would become the heart of his cult and the symbol of legitimacy. The others raged but could not stop him. As Babylon's heat thickened, Ptolemy stole the embalmed body and carried it west, first to Memphis, then to Alexandria, where it would rest for centuries, worshipped like that of a god. Meanwhile, the empire dissolved into blood and ambition. Antigonus took Asia, Seleucus claimed the east, Lysimachus ruled Thrace, Cassander took Macedonia, each carving away a piece of Alexander's dream. The borders he had burned into history melted like wax under the sun. In Babylon itself, silence returned. The great palaces stood empty, the canals clogged with dust. The city that had seen empires rise and fall now watched another die within its walls. Yet Alexander's shadow never left. Even centuries later, travellers swore they could still feel his presence, a restless spirit wandering through ruins, searching for a world that might have lived up to his vision. And so, Babylon became both his triumph and his tomb, the place where a mortal man tried to become divine, and where the divine finally remembered what it meant to die.